the weapon that changed the way man went to war worldwide. I'm of course talking about the gun. In this video, I'll be going over the Japanese matchlock. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. It went by many different names: Hinawaju, Tanegashima Teppo, or even just Teppo. Either way, it changed the way that the Japanese conducted warfare. The bow, or yumi, was the original projectile weapon of ancient Japan. Even though samurai archers could loose anywhere between 10 to 15 arrows with a gunner only firing once, the matchlock had two big advantages. It only took a week to a month to train a competent gunner, while it could take anywhere up to 2 years to train an archer. The other reason was that many of the earlier style of armors could be penetrated by the matchlock a lot easier than arrows could. But how did these weapons even reach Japan? See, the popular narrative is that guns and gunpowder in general first came to Japan when two Portuguese travelers became shipwrecked on the island of Tanegashima in 1593. The daimyo there, Tanegashima Tokitaka, would buy two of the travelers' matchlocks, and the rest is, of course, history. But this really isn't that true. During the attempted Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the Mongols used an almost hand grenade-like weapon on the samurai to a fair bit of success. After this, the Japanese copied the weapon going forward. And during the 14th and 15th centuries, when the Ming dynasty was formed from the ashes of the Yuan dynasty, trade once again resumed between China and Japan. With trade came a new weapon: bronze hand cannons. However, these weapons were difficult to use and were not all that reliable, so they were never widely used. Which is where the story of our two poor Portuguese travelers takes over, as these did in fact become very popular. In fact, within 10 years, an estimated 300,000 guns were said to have been made, making it one of the most armed countries in the entire world at the time. Oh, I also want to add that these weapons most likely came from Portuguese-held Goa, which is in India. Another fun fact was that the Japanese-made guns did not use springs, or not springs as we typically think of them. You see, the Japanese swordsmiths didn't really know how to make them, so instead they made coils. These guns would also come in several sizes and calibers. They even made experimental matchlock revolvers in the Edo period. Alright, now let's get into some of the different varieties of Japanese firelocks. Now, the ancient Japanese are often criticized for not having artillery. And while this is definitely not true, they weren't common. Why is this? Well, simply put, materials made it often hard to field them, and on top of that was the fact that the Japanese terrain made cannons very impractical most times. Instead, they used the Ozutsu, both as a gate destroyer and as a handheld piece of artillery that could take out groups of infantry in one shot. There was actual mounts for these too, so that they could be used as conventional cannon, so that they could be used on ships and even castle walls. Another use of this weapon was to shoot a missile known as bohia from it. When these missiles landed, they would explode and shoot shrapnel and flames everywhere, making them perfect to catch buildings on fire and really any wooden structure. If an Ozutsu was used to fire these missiles, they would actually be called Hyozutsu. Of course, the Ozutsu wasn't the only heavy gun used by the Japanese. They also used wall guns known as Zamazutsu. These massive guns were typically up to 1.5 meters in length, though there is examples much bigger than even that. They would typically be used as defensive weapons from the walls of fortresses. The longer barrel helped to keep the shot accurate over longer distances. They were also typically higher in caliber, which meant that these pretty much could take out anyone on a battlefield. The size also meant that ideally, this weapon would need 2 people both to shoot and load it effectively. These weapons became quite crucial for the Japanese when they needed to defend a location. The best example that I could possibly give you would be the siege of Ulsan, which you can check out here. Smaller pistols known as Tanzutsu were pretty rare on the battlefield. Most didn't consider them worth the hassle as they didn't really have the range or punch to make them of much use. Because of this, most were actually made in the Edo period as novelties. On a side note though, a lot of Western collectors have often mislabeled carbine matchlocks as Tanzutsu, but they weren't. And this actually leads us into the next matchlock type. Carbine matchlocks, or Bajouzutsu, were used by mounted samurai. Now curiously, there is a good bit of art that depicts mounted shooting. However, these pieces of art never show groups of mounted gunners. Instead, they always show single riders. Now this could possibly point to the fact that these riders were just that, single riders who went out to harass units or even take out important targets. Now these weapons would have also been given to mounted scouts, though not always. Starting in the 17th century with the installment of the Tokugawa shogunate, the use of civilian weapons became a very hot subject within the government. They had been before when the country was run by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the later 16th century, but this had mostly been towards swords. The Tokugawa were more concerned with military-grade firearms, and they were often confiscated. As such, civilians made use of Torizutsu, or bird guns. These were used for hunting small game as they were incredibly small in caliber. Farmers would also use them with a bit of gunpowder and no shot to scare away animals. Now this of course made the Tokugawa very happy as any rebellion wouldn't be done with these guns. The last matchlock variant worth talking about is the Samuraizutsu, or samurai gun. Now these from a distance weren't all that much distinguishable from the others I've mentioned, except that they were all custom to the samurai who commissioned its liking. This could include the grip, trigger, length of barrel, any art that would have been on it, and most importantly, caliber. See, many samurai gunners used their own personal guns and packed their own shot. This means that their guns wouldn't be able to use any shot from any of the others on the field. Now let's talk about some of the equipment used with these firelocks. Hyago were loading cylinders made from bamboo or carved wood with a small piece of cloth or paper at the bottom with shot, followed by another piece of cloth and then a measured amount of gunpowder, then closed. The teppotai or riflemen would then store them in boxes known as hyago doran at the waist. This allowed, from what I can tell, the gunners to shoot a max of 5 to 6 shots at approaching soldiers effectively at the 100 to 150 yard range as opposed to just one shot if they weren't using them. Now another piece of equipment used, and I have to say it's a pretty cool piece of equipment, was flash pan covers. These helped to protect the match from going out during rainstorms or heavy wind. But it also had the added benefit of hiding the glow of the match from the enemy, which made night skirmishes and raids a real threat. From what I've been able to tell, these pan covers were typically made of wood and leather that had been lacquered, though metal ones have actually been found dating to the 17th century. Oh, one last thing since we are on equipment used at night. Ropes would be tied around the waist and their guns. These were used to keep the guns perfectly level for night shooting. Now, if you enjoyed this video, check out this one right now about how the samurai got started, or this one to learn about the Imjin War. I'll see you next time.